This lecture is on the larynx. So for the larynx, inspired air leaves the pharynx by passing through a narrow opening called the glottis. We've talked about the glottis before. So the glottis, which is the opening itself, the glottis is surrounded by and protected by the larynx. And the larynx also protects the vocal cords. So the larynx is sort of this cartilaginous box, except it's not a box, but this cartilaginous structure that forms a cage, basically, which can then surround and protect the vocal cords. And then also you have the opening at the top of it, which is what air goes through to get where it's going. So the larynx then is made up of 9 cartilages. So 9 separate pieces of cartilage go into making up the larynx. And these are stabilized by ligaments and or skeletal muscles. So you have, as I said, this sort of cartilage contraption then that is being held together by these other things. So the upper margin then of the larynx is bound to the hyoid bone. All right, so what is this saying here? The upper margin, so the very upper portion of the larynx, then has at its top that odd sort of arc-shaped bone that is not connected to any other bone but sits on top of your larynx. And then the lower margin, and this is of the larynx, just like this is for the upper margin of the larynx. The lower margin of the larynx, then, is bound to the trachea. Then we have the epiglottis. Now, as the name implies, epi is going to mean above. So here we have the epiglottis, that which is above the glottis. And the epiglottis then sits at the top of the larynx. I drew a diagram of this in the last lecture. So we have the epiglottis here, and the epiglottis then is a blade-shaped flap, basically, of tissue that is reinforced by elastic cartilage. So this blade-shaped flap of cartilage, basically, then, can simply bend down and bend back. So the epiglottis then folds over the entrance of the larynx during swallowing. Thereby preventing food and liquid from entering. So what this is saying here is that you have this flap of tissue that sits on top of the hole. Here's the hole. You have a flap of tissue like this. So this is your trachea here, or rather this is the glottis. Here's the glottis, the opening. And you're going to have the esophagus back here. So when you swallow, the epiglottis simply folds over the glottis, the opening to your respiratory system, so that the food and the liquid then are diverted into the esophagus back here. But because it's reinforced with elastic cartilage, the flap goes down, and then when swallowing is over, it goes back up, and that's why you can breathe. So, as I said, that's how the epiglottis works. Then I'm just going to talk about a couple of the cartilages that make up the larynx. So the thyroid cartilage then is under the hyoid bone. And this forms much of the anterior and lateral surfaces of the larynx. And it curves and looks a bit like a shield. And if you've ever seen pictures of police people out in riot gear, you've seen those curved shields that they have. That's what this is referring to. I'm going to draw a couple of pictures here. So again, this is strictly diagrammatic, but I want to give you the idea that the thyroid cartilage kind of curves like this and offers a certain amount of protection to what is underneath. Some people might also say that it, in a way, resembles a saddle, which also curves, or a butterfly with its wings folded back. So what you're going to have then, and this is not really what it looks like, it is more diagrammatic than anything, but just to give you the idea. So we have something like this, but the point is that it is curved back, so there is a ridge on the anterior surface. You have this anterior ridge like this, and then it folds around to protect the sides of the larynx like this. So this then is a representation, a diagrammatic representation, I should say, of the thyroid cartilage. So basically, there is a prominent ridge, which I've just tried to draw there. So there's a prominent ridge then on the anterior surface of the thyroid cartilage, forms the Adam's apple. So when you find your Adam's apple here, you can actually feel that ridge there. That is that ridge there on the thyroid cartilage of your larynx. And you know it's your larynx because if you press, only do this gently, if you press, then you can wind up changing your voice because you have the vocal cords housed behind this. So when you found your Adam's apple, you found your thyroid cartilage, which is the most prominent cartilage on your larynx. I'm just going to talk about one other cartilage. I'm not going to talk about all of them. But there is also a cartilage called the cricoid cartilage. So the cricoid cartilage then lies below the thyroid cartilage, and sits just above the trachea. And that is it. Here, I'll let you take a look at that. Anyway, that is it for this lecture.